In this week's recommended readings, we see two really interesting applications of input-output analysis. One is looking at cultural industries in Brazil, and the other is looking at woody biomass processing in rural regions. Not two industries that I would think of as the best examples of anything. I probably wouldn't think of them at all. But what I really like about these papers is they take the core logic of the input-output model, tracing how these industries depend on one another, and they apply it in very different contexts and in places that you really wouldn't think of doing. That's what really make these papers valuable, is they show how flexible and powerful these models are for regional research. Now, I don't want you to think that you have to read these two papers. I know there's a lot of reading in this course, but at the very least, I want to include them so I could talk about this a little bit. If this is regional economics is something that you wish to consider and something you plan on using in the future, I definitely recommend reading these so you can see how it's applied and how it's really being done. But it isn't necessary for you to do this to sort of understand input-output models. So very briefly touching on the first paper, looking behind the scenes and assessment of the interdependence of Brazilian cultural industries. Again, not even a title that would pique my interest, but I really like it how it uses national input-output tables to measure the economic interconnections of the cultural sector. Again, not something we typically think about. Historically, a lot of this has looked at manufacturing and natural resources, those types of industries, not on like movies and TV and broadcast. So seeing how these industries are connected is something that's really valuable. So they use the idea of backwards and forward linkage analysis. These are some of the important tools of IO modeling to identify which sectors are the most connected. What's really striking is that these cultural industries are often dismissed as being small or self-contained, especially in other countries besides the US that tend to rely or view a lot of the US cultural output. Everyone watches Hollywood movies. The each different country's movie industries aren't as well developed as Hollywood. But seeing how dependent these industries are in a country like Brazil is really fascinating to see. So they stimulate production in manufacturing, trade, and services through demand for materials, advertising, things like logistics, and even needing creatives. So this paper expands our understanding of regional structure. So even industries that are focused on creativity and culture, things that don't seem very important, can have deep economic roots and significant multiplier effects within a country. Now, the second reading applies the same IO framework to something very different, rural resource-based economies. So the authors here use regional input-output modeling to estimate how developing biomass processing facilities, so basically ones that turn forestry byproducts into usable energy or usable materials, could affect rural employment and rural income. These are not exciting, these aren't sexy industries, but can they be good for the local economy? So they simulate different scenarios using multipliers to capture the direct effects, the indirect effects, and then the induced effects. What you would do in IO or with IO analysis. The results show that these industries can be powerful rural job creators, especially when regions are able to retain more of the value added locally. So they, when you think about it from the sort of regional planning perspective, they reduce leakages by sourcing inputs and services from nearby suppliers. So it's staying, the raw materials are coming from the region and then staying within the region after they produce the product. So what's important to think about here is not just the numbers that they estimate, but think about how they're applying the IO analysis framework for in this case, the woody biomass industry or for the cultural products industry.